Billionaire CEO couldn't believe her eyes when she saw her first love mopping the floor with an injured arm. Before anything else, let's see how connected we really are. What's one thing you can see from your window right now? The elevator doors opened to the executive floor at 11:47 p.m., and Victoria Hartwell stepped into the silence that only money could buy. 40 stories above Manhattan's streets, the headquarters of Hartwell Technologies hummed with the kind of quiet that cost $700 per square foot. At 24 years old, Victoria had built this empire from a dorm room idea into a $3 billion artificial intelligence company, and she'd done it without inheriting a single cent. Tonight, like most nights, she was the last one here. Her heels clicked against imported Italian marble as she walked toward her corner office, the city's lights sprawling beneath her like a conquered territory. She'd fired her CFO this morning, restructured her entire financial division by noon, and closed a deal with a Japanese conglomerate before dinner. The business press called her ruthless. Her board called her brilliant. Her therapist, in their single session before Victoria decided therapy was a waste of billable hours, had called her emotionally unavailable. Victoria preferred focused. She dropped her Hermes bag on her desk and pulled out her laptop, ready for another 3 hours of work before her driver arrived at 3 a.m. But something made her pause. Through her office's glass walls, she noticed a light on in the corridor near the conference rooms. A soft, yellowish glow that didn't belong in the LED white landscape of her domain. She frowned. Security should have cleared the building by 11. Victoria walked back into the hallway, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. She'd built this company on calculated risks and careful control, and unexpected lights at midnight qualified as neither. As she rounded the corner toward the executive conference room, she heard it. The rhythmic swish of a mop against tile, accompanied by someone's slightly labored breathing. A janitor, of course. She'd been so consumed with executive-level crises that she'd forgotten about the night-cleaning crew, the invisible army that kept her pristine world functioning while she slept. She was about to turn back when the man straightened up, shifting his mop bucket, and pain flickered across his face so quickly that anyone else might have missed it. But Victoria had spent 6 years training herself to read micro-expressions in boardroom negotiations, and she recognized agony being suppressed. "You're hurt," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. The man spun around, nearly knocking over his bucket. Water sloshed onto the floor he'd just cleaned. In the overhead light, Victoria got her first clear look at him, and the world tilted sideways. She knew this face, not the worn edges, not the tired lines around the eyes, not the careful blankness that came from years of making yourself invisible to people who didn't want to see you. But the bones beneath, the structure of this face, had been carved into her memory 6 years ago, in another lifetime, when she was still Victoria Chen, a sophomore at Columbia University who believed love mattered more than ambition. Joshua? The name came out as barely a whisper. His eyes met hers, and she watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. His left arm, she noticed now, hung slightly awkwardly at his side, and when he instinctively tried to hide it behind his back, he couldn't quite suppress a wince. Victoria. He said her name like a prayer and a curse simultaneously. "I didn't think you'd be here this late." 6 years. 6 years since Joshua Carter had been the brilliant philosophy major who'd challenged every assumption she'd ever made about life, success, and what truly mattered. 6 years since he'd kissed her in the Columbia Library at dawn, both of them exhausted from an all-night conversation about whether consciousness could be coded. 6 years since he'd vanished from her life without explanation, leaving only a note that said, "I'm sorry, please don't look for me." And now he was here, in her building, mopping her floors. "What happened to your arm?" Victoria's voice came out sharper than she intended, a CEO's command disguised as a question. "It's nothing, just a strain from moving some equipment earlier." Joshua's voice had the same rich timbre she remembered, but there was a careful flatness to it now, the tone of someone who'd learned to make themselves small. "Don't lie to me." Victoria stepped closer, and she saw him tense. "I've spent 6 years learning to read people, Joshua. You're in serious pain." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of the woman she'd become. Then his expression shuttered again. "It's really not your concern, Ms. Hartwell." Ms. Hartwell. The formality stung worse than she wanted to admit. "Everything in this building is my concern," she countered. "And you're clearly injured on the job. That makes it my liability and my responsibility." "Always the pragmatist," Joshua said softly, and there was something in his tone, not quite amusement, not quite sadness, that made Victoria's chest tighten. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shook his head, wincing again as the movement jarred his arm. "Nothing. Look, I appreciate your concern, but I need to finish this floor. I'm already behind schedule." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what 6 years had done. Joshua had always been lean, but now he carried himself with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that energy was a resource to be conserved. His clothes were clean but worn, his work boots resoled at least twice. His hands, which had once held poetry books and philosophy texts with reverent care, were now calloused and scarred. But his eyes, God, his eyes still held that same fierce intelligence that had first captivated her in a philosophy seminar, when he'd quietly dismantled the professor's entire argument about free will with a precision that had left the room speechless. "How long have you been working here now?" she asked. 3 weeks. He picked up his mop again, his movements careful. "I usually work the lower floors, but they needed someone to cover up here tonight. Like I said, I didn't think you'd still be around." 3 weeks. He'd been in her building for 3 weeks, and she'd never known. But then she rarely left her office, rarely paid attention to anyone below the C-suite level. The realization made her uncomfortable in a way she didn't want to examine. "What happened, Joshua?" The question burst out before she could stop it. 6 years ago, you were on track for a PhD at Princeton. You had a Fulbright, for God's sake. You were going to change the world with your work on ethical frameworks for emerging technologies, and now you're mopping floors? He finished for her, and there was no bitterness in his voice, which somehow made it worse. "Yeah, life doesn't always follow the plan, does it?" "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I'm giving." Joshua dunked his mop in the bucket, wrung it out with visible effort from his good arm. "Look, Victoria, I'm glad you've done well. Really. Everyone on campus knew you'd build something extraordinary. But this," he gestured between them, "this isn't a reunion. This is you finding out that your janitor happens to be someone you used to know. That's all. That's all." Victoria felt anger rising, sharp and unexpected. "You disappeared from my life without explanation. You ignored every call, every email, every message. And now you're acting like we were casual acquaintances who happened to take a class together." Joshua's jaw tightened. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me the truth. I want you to tell me why you left. I want—" Victoria stopped, realizing her voice had risen. She never lost control like this. Never. She took a breath, forcing herself back into the cool composure that had made her a legend in Silicon Valley. "I want to understand what happened to you." "No," Joshua said quietly. "You want to understand what happened to the version of me you remember. That person doesn't exist anymore." "I don't believe that." "Believe what you want. It doesn't change reality." He moved to push past her with his mop bucket, but she stepped into his path. "At least let me get someone to look at your arm. I have a doctor on retainer. He can be here in 20 minutes. Joshua laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you have a doctor on retainer. Do you have any idea how the other half lives, Victoria? Your retainer probably costs more than I make in a month." The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. "That's not fair," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its edge. "Fair?" Joshua shook his head. "You want to talk about fair? You're standing here in a suit that costs more than my rent, running a company worth billions, and you're surprised that the janitor can't just call a private physician. That's not unfair, Victoria. That's just reality. It's the world we live in." A world you were supposed to help change, she shot back. You were passionate about economic justice, about building systems that worked for everyone, not just the wealthy. What happened to that Joshua? Something flickered across his face, pain deeper than whatever was wrong with his arm. He learned that passion doesn't pay bills, and sometimes the people who need you most don't care about your grand theories of justice. What does that mean? Joshua was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. My sister got sick, really sick, leukemia. I was 3 months into Princeton when I got the call. She was 16 and the treatments were experimental, not covered by insurance. My parents had already mortgaged everything they had. Victoria felt the breath leave her lungs. Joshua, I'm so sorry, I didn't... How could you? He interrupted. I didn't tell you, I didn't tell anyone. I just left, came home and started working. Any job that would have me. Construction, restaurant work, night shifts at warehouses, whatever paid enough to help with the medical bills. But your Fulbright, your PhD program, couldn't Princeton have given you a leave of absence? Sure, for a semester, maybe 2. But Claire needed 3 years of treatment. 3 years of experimental drugs that cost $30,000 a month, 3 years of complications and hospital stays and praying that the next scan would show remission instead of metastasis. Joshua's voice remained steady, but Victoria could hear the weight of those years in every word. You don't pause your life for that. You trade it. Is she okay now? Victoria asked quietly. A real smile crossed Joshua's face, brief but genuine. She's at NYU pre-med, with a full scholarship. Wants to be an oncologist. She's been in remission for 2 years. That's wonderful. It is. Joshua picked up his mop again, which is why I don't regret a single choice I made. Not the PhD I'll never get, not the career I'll never have, not any of it. Claire's alive. Everything else is just details. Victoria watched him start cleaning again, his movements practiced despite the obvious pain in his arm. Everything in her training told her to walk away, to return to her office and her work, and pretend this conversation had never happened. Joshua had made his choices. She'd made hers. Their paths had diverged 6 years ago, and there was no bridge long enough to span the distance between a billionaire CEO and a night janitor, no matter what they'd once meant to each other. But something made her stay. You're going to hurt yourself worse if you keep using that arm, she said finally. At least let me call the building's medical service. It won't cost you anything. Joshua stopped mopping and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since their conversation started. Why do you care? It was a fair question. Why did she care? She'd built her entire adult life on strategic thinking and calculated decisions. Emotion was the enemy of good business. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to focus, to eliminate anything that didn't serve her goals. But standing here, looking at Joshua Carter, at the boy who taught her that consciousness might be more than algorithms, that humanity might matter more than efficiency, that love might be worth more than success, she couldn't quite remember why she'd believed those lessons were wrong. Because once upon a time, Victoria said carefully, you were the person who made me believe I could be more than just successful. You made me believe I could be good. Joshua's expression softened almost imperceptibly. And look how that turned out. You built an empire, I clean it. Don't do that. Don't reduce yourself. I'm not reducing myself, I'm being accurate. He gestured around the gleaming hallway. This is what I do, Victoria. I clean buildings, I mop floors, I empty trash cans. It's honest work, and it pays the bills. And most nights, I don't have to talk to anyone or explain myself to anyone. It's simple. Simple is good when your life has been anything but. And is that enough for you? Simple. Joshua was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Victoria's chest ache. It's what I have. Whether it's enough doesn't really matter. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard you say. Well, we all grow up sometime. Joshua managed a wry smile. Some of us just do it faster than others. Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that growing up didn't mean giving up, that there was still time to reclaim what he'd sacrificed. But she'd spent 6 years in boardrooms, and she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same expression she'd seen on entrepreneurs' faces right before they accepted a buyout offer they didn't want, the exhausted surrender of someone who'd fought as hard as they could and couldn't fight anymore. "The medical service," she said instead. "Please. If not for yourself, then because I'm the CEO and I'm making it a direct order to one of my building's employees." He studied her face, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, some private calculation she couldn't read. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but then I need to finish this floor, or I'll be written up." "I'll handle that," Victoria said, already pulling out her phone. "Of course you will." There was no mockery in Joshua's voice, just a kind of tired acceptance. "You're Victoria Hartwell. You handle everything." She paused in her dialing. "Is that supposed to be an insult?" "It's supposed to be an observation." Joshua set down his mop and leaned against the wall, cradling his injured arm. The Victoria I knew was brilliant and driven, but she was also uncertain sometimes. She questioned herself. She wondered if maybe success and happiness weren't the same thing. He looked at her directly. "You seem very certain now." "Certainty is efficient," Victoria said automatically, the words as familiar as a mantra. "Doubt is paralyzing." "And do you sleep better now that you've eliminated doubt from your life?" The question hit harder than it should have. Victoria thought about the prescription sleeping pills in her desk drawer, about the 4 a.m. wake-ups with her heart racing, about the way she sometimes caught her reflection in her office window and didn't quite recognize the woman staring back. "I sleep fine," she lied. Joshua smiled, sad and knowing. "Sure you do." Before Victoria could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen. Derek Morrison, her head of security. She swiped to answer. "Ms. Hartwell, we have a situation." Derek's voice was tense, professional. "There's been a security breach. Someone accessed the R&D servers from an external location approximately 40 minutes ago. They got past 3 layers of encryption." Victoria's entire demeanor shifted, snapping from the uncertain woman having an emotional conversation to the CEO, who'd built her reputation on crisis management. What data did they access? Still determining that. "But the breach signature matches attempts we've been tracking for the past month. This is the first time they've succeeded." "I'll be right there." Victoria ended the call and looked at Joshua. "I have to go, but the medical team will be here in 10 minutes. Wait for them." "Victoria, wait for them," she repeated, her voice carrying the authority that had made grown men twice her age follow her orders. "That's not a request." She was already moving toward the elevator when Joshua called after her. "Some things never change, do they?" Victoria stopped, turned back. "What?" "And you're still trying to save everyone," Joshua said quietly, "even when they don't need saving." Their eyes met across the hallway, and for a moment Victoria was 20 years old again, sitting in a cramped library study room at 3 in the morning, listening to Joshua explain why the desire to fix everything was both her greatest strength and her fatal flaw. "Maybe some things are worth saving," she said, "and maybe some things are already broken beyond repair." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Victoria stepped inside, her mind already racing through security protocols and damage assessment procedures. But as the doors began to close, she looked back at Joshua one last time. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between longing and resignation, between the memory of what they'd been and the acceptance of what they'd become. The doors closed, cutting off her view, and Victoria was alone with her reflection in the polished steel. She looked exactly like what she was, a young woman who'd achieved everything she'd ever wanted and couldn't quite remember why any of it had mattered in the first place. 40 stories below, the city sparkled with the lights of millions of lives being lived, millions of stories being written. And somewhere in that vast tapestry of humanity, there was a version of Victoria Chen, who'd chosen differently 6 years ago. A version who'd answered Joshua's calls, who'd fought to understand instead of walking away, who'd believed that love might be worth more than ambition, but that Victoria didn't exist anymore, just like Joshua's version of himself had disappeared into the necessity of keeping a sister alive. The elevator descended, and Victoria pulled out her phone, already composing a message to her head of cybersecurity. There was a breach to contain, damage to assess, possibly a crisis that could cost her company hundreds of millions if not handled correctly. This was what she was good at. This was where she belonged. The ache in her chest would fade. It always did. By the time the elevator reached the Security Operations Center on the 15th floor, Victoria had compartmentalized the encounter with Joshua into a locked box in her mind, filed away with all the other things she couldn't afford to feel. She was CEO Victoria Hartwell again, and Victoria Hartwell didn't have time for ghosts from the past or conversations about roads not taken. Derek Morrison was waiting for her, surrounded by screens showing lines of code and security logs. The breach originated from 3 separate IP addresses, all routed through anonymous servers. Professional work. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "Show me what they took," Victoria commanded, leaning over the main console. Derek pulled up a file list, and Victoria's blood ran cold. The stolen files were all related to Project Synthesis, her company's most ambitious development, an AI system designed to predict and prevent corporate espionage by analyzing patterns in human behavior. The irony wasn't lost on her. "This was targeted," she said. "Someone knew exactly where to look and when our vulnerabilities would be weakest." "Agreed, which means it's someone internal or someone with inside information." Victoria's mind was already running through possibilities, eliminating variables, calculating probabilities. "Pull the access logs for everyone who's had eyes on Project Synthesis in the past 6 months. Cross-reference with any unusual financial activity, sudden lifestyle changes, new relationships. I want a suspect list by morning." "On it." Derek hesitated. "Ms. Hartwell, there's something else. The breach happened during a very specific window, between 11:15 and 11:45 p.m. That's when the automated backup systems cycle, and our real-time monitoring has a 30-second lag. How many people know about that window?" 12, all senior staff. Victoria's jaw tightened. She'd built this company on trust, carefully calculated trust, but trust nonetheless. The idea that someone in her inner circle would betray her felt like a physical wound. "I want everyone's movements tracked for that time period. Security footage, badge access, everything." "Already pulling it," Derek typed rapidly, bringing up a grid of security camera feeds. Most of the executive floor was empty except for... He stopped, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Except for what?" Derek pulled up a timestamp. "Except for you, Ms. Hartwell. You were on the 43rd floor during the breach, talking to..." He zoomed in on the grainy footage, showing Victoria and Joshua in the hallway. "Who is that?" "A facilities staff," Victoria said quickly, her voice flat. "I found him injured and stopped to assess the situation. Standard workplace safety protocol." It wasn't technically a lie, but it felt like one. Derek nodded, accepting her explanation without question, as everyone always did. Victoria Hartwell's word was law in this building. But as she watched the security footage replay, seeing herself and Joshua caught in black and white pixels, she couldn't shake the feeling that the universe was laughing at her. While she'd been having a profound conversation about choices and sacrifice with her former lover, someone had been systematically stealing the crown jewels of her company. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, but Victoria's analytical mind rejected the obvious conclusion. Joshua Carter might be many things, but a corporate spy wasn't one of them. Was it? She thought about his appearance in her building just 3 weeks ago. She thought about his convenient positioning on the executive floor tonight, of all nights. She thought about how easy it would be to plant a wireless device while mopping floors, how invisible a janitor could be, how perfect a cover it would provide. No. Victoria shook her head, dismissing the thought. She'd spent years learning to read people, and everything about Joshua's surprise at seeing her had been genuine. His pain, his exhaustion, his resignation, all of it had been real. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "You also thought his love for you was real, and he still disappeared without a word." "Miss Hartwell," Derek's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said curtly. "Continue the investigation. I want hourly updates." "Yes, ma'am." Victoria left the security center and took the elevator back up to her office, but instead of diving into work, as she normally would, she found herself standing at her window, staring out at the city below. Somewhere in that urban sprawl, Joshua Carter was probably finishing his shift, going home to whatever small apartment he could afford on a janitor's salary, maybe thinking about the strange encounter with his ex-girlfriend, who'd become a billionaire while he'd become invisible. Or maybe he was counting the money he'd been paid to facilitate tonight's breach. Victoria pressed her forehead against the cool glass, disgusted with herself for even entertaining the thought. This was what her life had become: suspicion and calculation, viewing every human interaction as a potential threat or opportunity, unable to simply feel without analyzing the strategic implications. Joshua had been right. She had changed. The Victoria who'd fallen in love with a philosophy major's ideas about consciousness and morality had been replaced by someone who saw everything through the lens of profit and loss, risk and reward. Her phone buzzed, a message from the medical team she'd sent to check on Joshua. Patient refused treatment and left the premises. Arm injury assessed as severe muscle strain, possibly torn ligament. Recommended immediate follow-up. Patient declined. Of course he did, because Joshua Carter had spent 6 years learning to push through pain, to prioritize others' needs over his own, to make do with less than enough. Why would tonight be any different? Victoria pulled up her company's employee database and searched for Joshua's file. The information was sparse. Hired 3 weeks ago through an outsourced facilities management company. Background check clear. References adequate. No emergency contact listed. Address in Queens, a neighborhood she'd never been to, but knew from statistics was one of the city's most economically depressed areas. She could fire him. One click, and Joshua Carter would be removed from her building, from her life, from the uncomfortable questions his presence raised. It would be the smart move, the strategic move. Eliminate the variable that caused emotional interference. But Victoria's finger hovered over the keyboard, unable to complete the action. Instead, she opened a new window and began composing an email to her head of facilities. Subject: Employee Injury Protocol. She outlined new requirements for immediate medical assessment of any workplace injury, expanded insurance coverage for contract workers, and a policy ensuring no employee would face disciplinary action for health-related work delays. It would cost the company approximately $700,000 annually to implement. It was also the right thing to do. Victoria sent the email and leaned back in her chair, feeling the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the sky. She'd been awake for 22 hours, had fired a C-suite executive, closed a major deal, discovered a significant security breach, and come face to face with the man who'd once made her believe in something beyond balance sheets and market valuations. Just another Tuesday in the life of Victoria Hartwell, except it wasn't. Because as much as she wanted to compartmentalize and move on, something had shifted tonight. Seeing Joshua again had cracked something open inside her, something she'd kept carefully sealed for 6 years. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Her computer chimed with an incoming message from Derek. Initial suspect list compiled. 12 names, none of them Joshua's. Victoria noted with a relief she didn't want to examine too closely. She opened the file and began reviewing the data, slipping back into the familiar comfort of analysis and deduction. This was her domain. This was where she was strong. But even as she worked, part of her mind remained in that hallway on the 43rd floor, watching Joshua Carter mop floors with an injured arm, hearing him say that passion doesn't pay bills, seeing the weight of 6 years' worth of sacrifice carved into lines around his eyes. The sun rose over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. Below, 8 million people began their days, each carrying their own burdens, fighting their own battles, making their own impossible choices between what they wanted and what they needed. And in the gleaming tower of Hartwell Technologies, a young billionaire who had everything stared at her reflection in the window and wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd been calculating the wrong equation all along. Victoria's phone buzzed again. Another crisis, another decision, another opportunity to prove she was the right person to lead a $3 billion company. She answered it without hesitation, because that's what Victoria Hartwell did. But for the first time in 6 years, a part of her wished she could be Victoria Chen again, uncertain, questioning, but somehow more human than the woman she'd become. The day stretched ahead, full of meetings and decisions, and 1,000 small moments where she would choose ambition over connection, success over sentiment, the practical over the possible. Just like always. Except now, somewhere in the building 40 stories below, there was a man who remembered a different version of her. A man who'd once told her that the measure of a life wasn't in what you accumulated, but in what you were willing to sacrifice for the people you loved. A man who'd proven that philosophy by giving up everything. And Victoria Hartwell, who had spent 6 years believing that emotional detachment was strength, found herself wondering if maybe the real courage was in remaining vulnerable enough to care. The thought terrified her more than any boardroom battle ever had. She looked at the clock, 6:47 a.m. In a few hours, her executive team would arrive for the morning briefing. She'd need to address the security breach, calm investor fears, project strength and confidence. She'd need to be the Victoria Hartwell everyone expected, brilliant, decisive, unshakable. But right now, in this quiet moment between night and day, she allowed herself to be simply Victoria, a woman who'd seen a ghost from her past and realized that some doors, once closed, could never quite be locked completely. Joshua Carter had walked back into her life carrying a mop and bucket, his arm injured, his dreams deferred, his potential sacrificed on the altar of family loyalty. And somehow, in the space of one conversation, he'd reminded her of everything she'd given up to become successful. The question wasn't whether she could go back. She couldn't. The question was whether she could find a way forward that honored both the woman she'd become and the girl she'd been. Victoria didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 6 years, she was willing to ask the question. And maybe, she thought as the morning sun flooded her office with light, maybe that was enough for now. She stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The city was waking up below her, delivery trucks making their rounds, early commuters heading to the subway, street vendors setting up their carts. All those lives, all those stories, all those people making their way through another day with whatever dignity and determination they could muster. Joshua was somewhere down there, maybe on a subway heading home to Queens, maybe already asleep in that small apartment she'd never seen, maybe lying awake like she was, replaying their conversation, wondering if crossing paths again after 6 years was fate or just cruel coincidence. Victoria's reflection stared back at her from the window, a young woman in an expensive suit, standing in a corner office that represented everything she'd ever worked for. But the face looking back at her seemed like a stranger's. When had she stopped recognizing herself? She thought about the girl she'd been at Columbia, that Victoria had stayed up all night debating philosophy, not because it would help her career, but because the ideas themselves were intoxicating. She'd fallen in love with Joshua Carter not because he could advance her ambitions, but because he'd made her think differently about everything she thought she knew. That Victoria had believed that being smart enough, working hard enough, and caring enough could change the world. This Victoria knew better. Victoria. She knew that intelligence without ruthlessness got you exploited, That hard work without strategic positioning got you overlooked. That caring too much made you vulnerable to people who would use your compassion against you. She'd learned these lessons well. They'd made her rich and successful and utterly alone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd built a company that employed 3,000 people, but she couldn't name 5 of them who she'd consider actual friends. She had a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, but she spent most nights sleeping on the couch in her office. She could buy almost anything in the world, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd wanted something that money could purchase. Victoria's phone buzzed again, a reminder about her 8 a.m. call with the Tokyo office. She had 45 minutes to shower, change clothes, review the briefing materials, and transform herself back into the version of Victoria Hartwell that the world expected to see. She could do it. She'd done it every day for the past 6 years. But as she gathered her things and headed toward the private bathroom attached to her office, she couldn't stop thinking about Joshua's words. "You're still trying to save everyone, even when they don't need saving." Was that what she was doing? Trying to save people who didn't need or want her intervention? Or was she trying to save herself from the emptiness that came with having everything except what actually mattered? Victoria didn't know. But as she stood under the hot shower, letting the water wash away the exhaustion of another sleepless night, she made a decision. She wouldn't fire Joshua. She wouldn't pretend the encounter had never happened. She wouldn't lock away the questions he'd raised and go back to business as usual. For once in her carefully controlled life, Victoria Hartwell was going to do something without calculating the return on investment. She was going to let herself feel whatever this was: confusion, curiosity, regret, hope, and see where it led. The decision terrified her, but it also made her feel more alive than she had in years. By the time Victoria emerged from the bathroom, dressed in a fresh suit and ready to face another day of decisions that would affect millions of dollars and thousands of lives, she'd made another choice. Tonight, if Joshua was working the executive floor again, she'd be here, not because she had work to do, though she always had work to do, but because she wanted to talk to him again, to understand what had happened to both of them in the past 6 years. To see if maybe, just maybe, the people they'd become could find some way to connect across the vast distance that separated their worlds. It was foolish. It was impractical. It was everything Victoria Hartwell had trained herself not to be, and that's exactly why she was going to do it. The morning proceeded as mornings always did. Video calls with international partners, emergency meetings about the security breach, rapid-fire decisions about everything from product development to personnel issues. Victoria moved through it all with her usual precision, giving no indication that anything had changed. But something had changed. Victoria could feel it like a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, like the moment before a storm when the air becomes charged with possibility. At 11 a.m., her assistant buzzed through. "Miss Hartwell, you have a visitor in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. A Joshua Carter." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. "Send him up." 5 minutes later, Joshua stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, looking completely out of place in his worn jeans and faded jacket. His left arm was in a sling now, and he moved with the careful stiffness of someone managing significant pain. "You should be resting that arm," Victoria said, coming out of her office to meet him. "Probably," Joshua agreed, "but I needed to tell you something, and I didn't want to wait until tonight. If I lost my nerve, I might never say it." "Say what?" He took a breath. "Thank you for caring enough to call the medical team last night, even when I was too stubborn to accept help, for implementing those new injury protocols. Yes, I heard about that. For remembering that people like me exist, even when we're invisible most of the time." Victoria felt her throat tighten. "You were never invisible to me, Joshua. Maybe not 6 years ago, but I am now, or I was, until last night." He shifted his weight, favoring his injured arm. "Look, I know this is awkward. You're Victoria Hartwell, CEO of a billion-dollar company, and I'm the guy who mops your floors. The world we live in doesn't exactly encourage friendships across that kind of divide." The world we live in is wrong about a lot of things, Victoria said quietly. Joshua smiled, sad and knowing. Maybe, but it's still the world we have to navigate. He paused, seeming to gather courage. I came here to say that seeing you last night reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That I used to be someone who thought big ideas mattered more than big paychecks. That I used to believe changing one person's perspective was worth more than changing their bank account. You still are that person. No, I'm not, but maybe I could be again. Or maybe I could be some version of both, the person who does what needs to be done, but doesn't forget why it matters. Joshua met her eyes directly. You asked me last night why I left. The truth is I left because I loved you too much to let you sacrifice your dreams for my crisis. You were always going to build something extraordinary, Victoria. I didn't want to be the weight that held you back. Victoria's vision blurred with tears. She hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. You weren't a weight. You were the person who made me believe my dreams were worth pursuing in the first place. Then maybe we both need to remember who we were before life forced us to become who we are. Joshua glanced around the pristine executive floor with its expensive art and designer furniture. I should go. You have a company to run, and I have a shift starting in a few hours. But I wanted you to know, seeing you again, even in these circumstances, reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving it. Joshua, wait. Victoria stepped closer to him. I don't know what this is or what it could be. I don't know if there's any way to bridge the gap between your world and mine. But I'd like to try, if you're willing. He studied her face for a long moment. What are you suggesting? Coffee. Tomorrow morning before your shift. There's a diner near the building. Nothing fancy, just two old friends catching up. Victoria managed a small smile. Unless you think that would be too complicated. Complicated is my specialty these days, Joshua said, returning the smile. Coffee sounds good, but I'm buying. I may not have much, but I have my pride. Deal. Do. After Joshua left, Victoria returned to her office and stared at her schedule for the next day. She had back-to-back meetings from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m., a board presentation to prepare, and at least 50 emails that required immediate attention. She cleared her 6 a.m. slot and marked it as unavailable. For the first time in 6 years, Victoria Hartwell was choosing connection over efficiency, and while it terrified her, it also felt like the first honest decision she'd made in a very long time. The rest of the day blurred past in a haze of conference calls and strategic planning sessions. But underneath it all, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not for a business deal or a product launch, but for a simple cup of coffee with someone who knew her before she became successful. That evening, as she prepared to leave the office at the relatively reasonable hour of 9 p.m., Victoria received an email from Derek Morrison. The security investigation had narrowed down the breach to 3 potential suspects, all senior staff members with access to the vulnerable systems. None of them Joshua Carter. Victoria exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She'd known intellectually that Joshua wasn't involved, but having it confirmed in black and white removed a small knot of doubt she'd been carrying since last night. She forwarded the email to her legal team with instructions to proceed carefully but thoroughly, then shut down her computer and headed for the elevator. As the doors opened, she saw the night cleaning crew arriving. Men and women in matching uniforms, pushing carts loaded with supplies, ready to make the building shine for another day of high-powered business. She recognized a few faces now that she was paying attention. Maria, who always hummed while she worked. David, who had pictures of his grandchildren taped inside his cart. Teresa, who was taking online classes to become a nurse. People she'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing them. "Good evening," Victoria said, making eye contact with each person. They looked surprised, but murmured greetings in return. As Victoria stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished doors and barely recognized herself. She was smiling. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the diner at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. She'd chosen a corner booth and ordered coffee, then sat with her hands wrapped around the warm mug, watching the door. Joshua arrived at exactly 6 a.m., his arm still in the sling, but his step lighter than it had been yesterday. He slid into the booth across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two people who'd once known everything about each other, and now had to start from scratch. "Hi," Joshua said. "Hi," Victoria replied. And then, somehow, the conversation started flowing. They talked about Claire's recovery and her dreams of becoming an oncologist. They talked about the books Joshua had been reading and the philosophical questions that still kept him up at night. They talked about the loneliness of success and the dignity of honest work. They didn't talk about what came next because neither of them knew. But as the sun rose over the city and the diner filled with early morning commuters, Victoria Hartwell realized something profound. She'd spent 6 years building an empire, but she'd forgotten how to build a connection with another human being, Joshua Carter had reminded her. And whether this was the beginning of something new or just a brief reconnection with her past, Victoria was grateful for the reminder that wealth wasn't measured only in dollars and success wasn't measured only in achievements. Sometimes the most valuable thing you could have was someone who saw you, really saw you, and thought you were worth knowing anyway. "I should get to work," Joshua said finally, glancing at his watch. "My shift starts in 30 minutes. "And I have a board meeting at 8, Victoria replied. They stood, and there was an awkward moment where neither of them knew quite how to say goodbye. Finally, Joshua extended his good hand, and Victoria shook it, feeling the calluses that had replaced the soft skin she remembered. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "I'd like that," Victoria said. As she watched him walk away, heading toward another day of invisible labor, while she returned to her tower of glass and steel, Victoria felt the weight of 6 years' worth of choices settling on her shoulders. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't undo the divergent paths that had brought them to this moment. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way forward that honored both who she'd become and who she used to be. It wouldn't be easy. The world didn't encourage friendships between billionaires and janitors. Society had firm ideas about who belonged where and with whom. But Victoria Hartwell had built a $3 billion company by refusing to accept other people's limitations. Maybe it was time to apply that same stubborn determination to her personal life. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. And for the first time in 6 years, Victoria felt truly alive. 3 months passed like a slowly turning page in a book Victoria couldn't put down. She told herself she wasn't looking for Joshua during her late nights at the office. She told herself the new employee welfare policies had nothing to do with one specific janitor. She told herself that the reason she stayed until midnight most evenings was purely about work efficiency. But the human heart, Victoria was learning, kept its own accounting system, one that didn't balance like a corporate ledger. Joshua worked the executive floors every Tuesday and Friday now. Victoria had subtly arranged that through the facilities manager, though she'd never admit it. Their conversations started cautiously, a polite greeting, a comment about the weather, the careful small talk of two people pretending they hadn't once known every intimate corner of each other's souls. Then gradually, the walls came down. It started with books. Victoria had been reading during a rare break when Joshua noticed the title, a dense philosophy text about artificial consciousness she was using to inform her company's AI ethics framework. "Chalmers' Hard Problem of Consciousness," Joshua said, pausing with his cleaning cart. "Still searching for the ghost in the machine." Victoria looked up, startled. "You remember?" "I remember everything," he said quietly, then seemed to regret the admission. "That particular debate, anyway. We spent an entire weekend arguing about whether consciousness could emerge from complexity alone. You said it couldn't. That there was something fundamentally irreducible about subjective experience. And you said I was being romantic. That everything, including consciousness, was ultimately just information processing." Joshua smiled, and for a moment, the exhaustion left his face. "I still think you're wrong." "Prove it," Victoria challenged, and just like that, they were 20 years old again. The conversations became a ritual. Joshua would arrive around 11. Victoria would pretend she just happened to be taking a break. And they'd talk, really talk, about ideas and philosophy and the questions that had no clean answers. He told her about the books he read on subway rides, the podcasts he listened to during long cleaning shifts, the way he'd managed to keep his mind alive even as circumstances forced his ambitions into smaller and smaller containers. She told him about the loneliness of success, about making decisions that affected thousands of lives, about the weight of being responsible for so much and connected to so little. "You've built something extraordinary," Joshua said one night, looking around the gleaming office. "But you look exhausted, Victoria. When's the last time you did something just because it made you happy?" "Happiness is a luxury," she replied automatically. "No, happiness is a necessity. Luxury is thinking you can survive without it." 2 weeks later, Victoria found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She left work at 7 p.m. and went to a small cafe in Queens, where Joshua had mentioned working weekend mornings. She told herself she was just curious about the neighborhood, conducting informal market research. But when she walked in and saw Joshua behind the counter, his face lighting up with surprised pleasure, Victoria had to admit the truth. She was choosing connection over ambition, even if just for one evening. They talked until the cafe closed. Then they walked through the neighborhood, past buildings Victoria would never normally see, talking to people she would never normally meet. Joshua introduced her as "my friend Victoria," without any mention of her company or wealth, and for the first time in years, Victoria felt like a person rather than a brand. "Why did you really leave?" she asked as they sat on a bench overlooking the East River, the Manhattan skyline glittering across the water like a promise or a threat. 6 years ago, you could have told me about Claire. I would have helped." Joshua was quiet for a long moment. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you. You would have helped. You would have thrown money at the problem, fixed everything, and I would have owed you for the rest of my life. My sister's survival would have been another item on Victoria Chen's list of accomplishments." "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's how it would have felt." He turned to look at her. "I needed to save her myself, Victoria. I needed to prove that I could protect the people I loved without being rescued by someone else's wealth. Does that make sense?" It did. Painfully, it did. "I spent 6 years hating you for leaving," Victoria admitted, "and now I'm realizing you left because you loved me too much to let me solve your problem." "I left because I loved you enough to let you become who you needed to be," Joshua corrected gently, "without the burden of my crisis pulling you down. You were always going to build something extraordinary. I didn't want to be the reason you didn't." Victoria felt tears, threatening, real tears, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in years. "That's the most devastatingly selfless thing anyone has ever done for me, or the most cowardly. I never gave you the choice." "No," she agreed, "you didn't." They sat in silence, watching the river flow past, carrying the debris of the city toward the ocean. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "The security breach 3 months ago. They never found who did it." "I know," Joshua said. "I heard people talking. For about 2 weeks I wondered if it was you, if your appearance in my building was too coincidental, if I was being played." Joshua turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And what did you conclude?" "That I'd rather be wrong and trust you than be right and lose you again." Something shifted in Joshua's eyes, something that looked like hope, struggling against resignation. "Victoria, I can't be what you need. I can't fit into your world. I can't wear the right clothes to your galas, or make small talk with your board members, or be anything other than exactly what I am, a guy who mops floors and reads philosophy books on the subway." "I don't need you to be anything else," Victoria said, and she meant it. "I need you to be exactly what you are, the person who reminds me that there's more to life than quarterly earnings and stock prices, the person who makes me feel human again." "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When your colleagues see you with the janitor and start questioning your judgment?" When it becomes a liability to your reputation, then I'll handle it, Victoria said firmly. I've handled everything else. Joshua smiled sadly. You're still trying to save everyone. No, Victoria replied, taking his hand. I'm trying to save myself. 6 months later, the business press ran a story about Victoria Hartwell's unusual relationship with a former academic working in building maintenance. The board expressed concerns. Investors questioned her judgment. Social media had opinions ranging from touching to savage. Victoria addressed it in a single statement. My personal life has no bearing on my ability to lead this company. If the market disagrees, they're welcome to short the stock. The stock went up 12%. Joshua still worked as a janitor. It turned out he liked the simplicity, the honest physical labor, the way it freed his mind to think about bigger questions. But he also started taking online classes again, working toward that PhD he'd abandoned, this time on his own terms and his own timeline. Victoria learned to leave work at reasonable hours sometimes, to value connection over achievement, to measure her life in moments of genuine joy rather than dollars in the bank. They didn't solve all their problems. Class differences didn't magically disappear. The world still judged them, still found their relationship strange or scandalous or touching, depending on who was looking. But on Tuesday and Friday nights, when Joshua arrived on the executive floor with his cleaning cart, Victoria would be waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a new philosophical question to debate. And in those moments, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and success, Victoria Hartwell finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. Not because she had everything, but because she'd learned what was actually worth having. The lesson had cost her 6 years, a few $1 million in reputation management, and the comfortable certainty that success and happiness were the same thing. It turned out they weren't, and it turned out that was okay.